Have you ever met anybody famous? Like, think for a moment. Who's the most famous person you've met? Maybe you'd say, well, actually, I don't know that I've met anybody too famous. Or maybe you have. Maybe you've met somebody that everybody else would have heard about. What's the allure of celebrity? Why are we always awed when we hear about or run into or meet somebody who's famous? What is it about being a celebrity, right? Well, I think if we were to think about it for a minute, it kind of feels like that person has made it, right? We use that phrase sometimes, like that person, they achieved success in their industry. They made it. They are significant. And maybe you've had that fleeting thought, even just briefly, like, what if I had what they had? What if I had that same success, or that same level of fame, or if I had the money that they had, or boy, have you seen the house that they live in, or they sure have a lot of nice cars. Has that ever crossed your mind? Okay. Maybe you've never thought about that specifically, and you're completely fine without photographers and those magazines in the supermarket checkout lane covering your every move. But if you haven't thought that, maybe you have wondered in a more serious moment, does what I do matter? Does my life have any meaning? Does it have impact? Is my life significant? I want to do something that makes a difference. You ever thought that? We're starting a 2-week series today, just 2 weeks, entitled The Fool. Scripture has a lot to say about the fool. And really there's a couple of different definitions. The Bible kind of defines the fool or has 2 different categories for the fool. And these categories are not mutually exclusive. They do overlap a little bit. And we're going to talk about both categories. The first way the Bible kind of looks at the fool is what I've just called a foolish way of living. Right, if we were to give a dictionary definition for this idea, it's one who's characterized by thoughts, or behaviors, or attitudes, or judgments that lack sense, prudence, and discretion. Right, like that person's being foolish. They're doing different things that you would say, that's a fool. You might think of verses like Proverbs chapter 18, verse 2. A fool does not delight in understanding, but only wants to show off his opinions. Next week, we're going to look at this category of fool, kind of do a word study, something that's going to feel a little different than what our sermons normally might feel like. We're going to do a deep dive, a word study on fool next week as it relates to this category. But there's a second category of fool, and this is what we're going to look at this week. And this one I've just called a foolish life. Now, instead of giving you the dictionary definition on this one, let's take a look at what Jesus had to say about it. Jesus used the word fool a few different times when talking to people. He called them a fool, specifically when he talked to Pharisees. For example, Luke chapter 11, verses 39 and 40. But the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and evil. Fools! Didn't he who made the outside make the inside too?" There's another example when Jesus used the word fool. This is the parable of the rich fool. That's what the heading in my Bible says. Maybe yours says the same thing. The parable of the rich fool shows up just a few verses after what we just read. This is Luke chapter 12. Let me read in verse 13. Would you read with me? Someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." "Friend," he said to him, "who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" He then told them, "Watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions." Now, there's a couple of different things that are happening here in what we just read. First, there would have been specific Old Testament regulations that dictated how inheritances were to be split. Right now, we don't know the exact problem. We're not sure what the one brother was doing to the other, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter to the story. What does matter is the problem that Jesus correctly identifies here, greed. And Jesus says, listen, who appointed me the judge over you? And Jesus may be implying he doesn't have legal standing to make this decision. He wasn't an actual judge there in that town. But more likely what he's saying is he didn't come to deal with such temporary things. Right? He was here for eternal reasons. He was here for bigger reasons than this temporary idea of an earthly inheritance. That was of such little consequence, right? It just doesn't matter when viewing the bigger picture. I think that's what Jesus might be saying here. In other words, Jesus might have been saying, listen, this doesn't matter. Don't bring this to me. I'm here for much bigger reasons. Right? It'd be like if you had a job and the CEO was coming to visit. Right? Maybe the CEO was just somebody you'd always seen on a video or read about in the brochure or something like that. You didn't really know who the CEO was, but they were going to come along and make a visit at your specific location. So everything was polished and spit shined and everything looked great. And everybody's like, you put on some nicer clothes, make a good impression on the CEO, right? And he's thinking big picture. How do we increase profits? How do we fix this? How do we do that? And he happens to come by your desk and how's it going for you? You say, oh, I'm doing great. But while you're here, I've got a question. Mr. CEO, you might have noticed that our bathrooms have both the paper towel dispenser and the hand dryer. And since you're here, when I wash my hands, which one should I use? Would it be better for me to use the paper towel dispenser or the hand dryer? Huh? What? Why are you talking to me about that? That doesn't matter to me. Right? That's kind of what's going on here just a little bit. Instead, Jesus is saying, focus on what does matter. What does have eternal significance. And he says, guard, to protect, be aware of, be on the lookout for greed. This intense desire, this selfish desire for more, something like money or power. You think about how many scams are effective because people are greedy. Right? We always just want that get rich quick. Or the prosperity gospel has taken off because of this idea of, or pyramid schemes, or coveting, or whatever it might be, right? We're always just looking, how do we get more as easy as we can? And Jesus then tells this parable, or he tells this story to illustrate the idea that life is more important than material things. Let's keep reading. Now we're into verse 16. Well, then he told them a parable. A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do, since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. God said to him, you fool. There's that word. This very night, your life is demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. From time to time, I will help my kids with their schoolwork. Maybe you've done something similar. And don't tell my kids this, but often when I'm helping them, like with their math or their English or something like that, I think, when have I ever used this in my life? That thing you used to say when you're at school, like, no one ever is going to need to know how you solve this. And now I'm older and I'm like, you know what, that was actually kind of true. You ever been like that with your schoolwork or helping your kids with it? It's like, but you can't really say that, right? You can't say, hey, you're never going to use this. Or what about like diagramming sentences? Right? Has there ever been a time when you've been like, I must diagram this sentence, and I'm so glad I learned this back in the third grade. Do we have any English teachers out there? You're probably plugging your ears right now listening to me say that. But hang on before you do, because I've got news for you. Maybe for the first time ever, diagramming sentences came in helpful for me in this verse. Let me show you what I mean. The opening verse in this parable that we just read is really important. Because the subject of the sentence is not the rich man, but it's land, right? Look at that again. A rich man's land was very productive. What was productive? Not the rich man, the land. That's really important to understanding this parable. The prosperity of the rich man is not his doing. It comes as a result of the productivity of his land. His prosperity, what he had, derives from a source other than himself. But the rich man is focused on himself. What shall I do? I'm going to store my crops. I'll do this. I'll tear down, etc. And the rich man ran out of room to store all of his goods. He had a lot, and so he builds bigger barns with the attitude that he would then have an easy life because he had everything that he could possibly want or need. And he's maybe thinking to himself, right, like, I've made it. I'm successful. I'm significant. I've done something with my life. Look at what I've accomplished. But God's response? He calls him a fool. Because when he died that night, all of his goods, everything that he had accomplished, everything that he thought brought him significance would do nothing for him. I was reminded of the verse in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7 that says, "For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out." So where did he go wrong? Why was he a fool? I mean, he was a success by the world's standards, right? Like when the world would have eulogized this man, it would have been glowing. Like, look at what he accomplished. Look at everything that he did, all of his contributions. But his foolishness comes through his oblivion to God. There are many forms of pride. But the worst of them is to think that one has no need of God. In this story that Jesus tells, this rich man doesn't acknowledge the source of his blessings. Right? It didn't come from him. And he puts his security in his wealth. The man was a fool, not because he sought wealth, but because he imagined that wealth existed in things, and that things, rather than God, could satisfy his life. Now, maybe up to this point, you've been listening and you've been wishing or saying in your mind, I wish greed for money, I wish that was a problem for me. I wish I had so much money, I would struggle with this, right? But maybe you're just getting by and having too much money hasn't been a problem for you. But here's what I want you to know. This parable applies to so much more than just money. Right, where else can we put our security? What else do we trust in? Where else do we look for significance and success? Well, money, as we mentioned, but maybe our career, or our achievements. Maybe we find our security just in our comfort, in the family, the relationships that we have, the people that we know. Maybe we find our security just in our health, or our power and influence, or just our happiness. I want to be happy now. Maybe we put our security in the idea that this life is all there is. There is nothing after this to be working towards. Maybe that's what we trust in. I mean, this is everything that the world teaches us, right? You need this thing to be successful, or buy that to make you happy. Do this to find fulfillment. Enjoy the comfortable life. You deserve it. Achieve this standard. And listen, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with planning for the future. There isn't anything wrong with enjoying good things. But the people who define success in life, significance in life, by what they possessed on earth, what they enjoyed just on this earth, if that's how they define success, they will be called fools. It's foolish to think that our lives will not end and that we won't have to give an account before God. It's foolish to think that our lives are defined by what we have. And this just goes completely against the culture. Doesn't it? This is not the messaging that we normally hear. To live in a way that is rich towards ourselves and stingy towards God, God calls that foolish. And in verse 15, when it says, we're not rich toward God, that's a synonym for treasure in heaven. We won't have it if we live as fools, treasure in heaven. Luke chapter 18, verse 22 is where this idea comes from. When Jesus heard this, he told him, "You still lack one thing. Sell all you have and distribute it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." There it is again, those words, follow me. You remember those words from last week, don't you? If you happen to be with us. If you haven't, you can go back on our YouTube page. It's the last sermon in the Peter series where we dive into these words, follow me. Those were Jesus' parting words to Peter. Right, last week we looked at John chapter 21, and Jesus had said to Peter, "If you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, take care of one another. Live a selfless life, Peter. Devote yourself to the spiritual well-being of others. Follow me." And we looked how in that idea of follow me, it means Jesus is going with us. Jesus will go in front of us, and Jesus knows where we're going. Now here's the thing. Jesus is communicating the same message here in the parable of the rich fool. It's kind of like Jesus is always emphasizing the same things. Have you noticed that in Jesus' teaching? Jesus is saying here, live your life for something that counts. Live your life for something that will have eternal significance. Live for something that will carry over with you past this life on earth. Live a selfless life. Do not put your hope and your focus on this earth, but keep your eyes fixed on me, Jesus is saying. Keep your eyes fixed on eternal things. You have wealth. God has blessed you. Great. It won't save you. But you can use it to help those in need and make an impact for the kingdom. You've seen success. You've achieved a lot of things. Great. God has blessed you in that way, but it won't save you. But you can use your influence to further God's kingdom. You've been blessed with good health, with family. Great. Won't save you. But you can use it to minister to those who are less fortunate and need your help and need your relationship. We started by asking the question, does my life have significance? Is what I'm doing making a difference? But to really answer that question, we have to answer this one. By whose standard? Who's the judge? Who gets to decide what really is significant? Who determines the definition of a fool? Right? Because when you really stop and think about it, the standards on this earth, well, they vary quite a bit, don't they? I mean, for every celebrity that you would say has significance, for every celebrity that you think has made it, wow, if I could just have a glimpse of what they had, right? Well, you would find then a whole group of people who don't care about that particular achievement. They don't care about that sport, or they don't care about that invention, or whatever it might be. And that person is really of no significance to them. Even the marketing that's aimed at you and me, right? We never know where to land. You'll find one that says, well, drink this, or wear that. Or you'll impress others by driving this. But then the next commercial that comes on will be like, no, drink that instead. Or no, you don't want to wear that, you want to wear this. You want to shop here. And you'll be more impressive if you're in this particular car. Where's the standard? Wouldn't it just be better if there was one standard, one judge, one person who got to decide what was significant? One person who decided who was the fool and who wasn't? Well, friends, that's the good news. There will come a day for each and every one of us where God will call us to the judgment seat. We'll give an account for how we lived. We will stand before the one who sets the standard, who determines significance. God is the one who writes the test. But the great news is that He's given us all the answers. Now, make no mistake, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. Salvation is by grace alone. Human merit has no standing before God. But how we live, our actions, our call to focus on what's eternal and significant, that serves as an indication as to where our heart is. And so if you're wondering whether your life has significance, if you've ever wondered, does what I do matter? And ask yourself this question. Am I living for now, or am I living for later? Am I going to Jesus and saying, Jesus, tell my brother to split this inheritance with me? Or am I going to Jesus and saying, Jesus, I want to live a selfless life. I want to take care of your sheep. I want to be faithful in those things that matter for eternity. So parents, when you're grinding out each day, and you're trying to be intentional with your kids, doing the little things, trying to instill spiritual truths, trying to be faithful with those young souls that have been entrusted to you by God, you're living for later. Friends, when you work to encourage one another, to comfort one another, to grieve with one another, to pray for one another, and you are others focused, you're living for later. When you have that conversation with your neighbor or coworker that maybe requires a step of boldness, a step out of your comfort zone, you're living for later. When you use your gifts and talents that God has entrusted to you, combined with the right motives, you're living for later. When you strive to do the right thing, even though that right thing is going to cost you something, it'd be far easier to go that way. You're living for later. When you sacrifice your own personal comfort for the eternal good of others, when you live the selfless life that God has called us to live, you are living for later. When you're just trying to be faithful today with what God has given you, and you decide to be faithful and trustworthy tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, taking it one day at a time, relying on God's mercies that are new every morning, you are living for later. Significance is not measured by what you accomplish on earth, but by who you are trusting in and who you live for. As Christ followers, strive to live your life in such a way where you will hear from the only one who matters. You were no fool. You invested in things that mattered and carried eternal significance. You kept your eyes focused on me and followed me. Well done, good and faithful servant.